Thank you. Well, I'm so glad we put the panels together. I'm nice to this. So I'm going to improvise my thing for today, and we'll just see how it goes. All right. Our panel is Dove Poetry 40 years after. Woo! So I have some points. I'll pull from a paper instead of going through the whole paper. But as you know, with us, Dove Poet, our praxis, our thinking, everything that our activism is manifested in the work itself. So we want people to feel the work and to take away a dimensionality from the work more than we want them to listen to any kind of paper that we could ever write or so on. I'm going to start out by reading some material, some poems, or a poem or two, and interspersing various little things inside the points I want to make. A voice signifies the real, relational, spiritual quest, model-dependent breath. A shadows feel, and also real, operation, imagination, digital, virtual and reality, and virtual reality, physics dualities, beyond conventions to reinventions. What does a voice becomes when it stands for something? What does a voice becomes when it stands for something? Questioning and voicing to feel a sense of the real, poets turning routine into ritual, resounding sound symbols of language into language play, unravels the embroidered geometry of the unilateral reality. What does a voice becomes when it stands for something? The what shall speak for itself, the poet says. The what shall speak for itself. Voice threading stance and eyes and light pull through the cracks in things that let the light in. Mr. Leonard Cohen. And order against disorder and randomness expressed in the poet's sound, voice sounding, resounding, sounding in the poet's sound. So to you, the young poets, the spoken word, to you who cite up your voice, crafted vision, set alive the energy in words, image, shapes, colors, vibe. To you who say what you have to say so you don't boss up. Say to self-define so you don't walk blind. To you word chatterers, pain splatterers, line twisters, did the mischievers. I say to you, go to glory. I play forward, link in our ancestor story. Word, sound, power, connectivity station, a spiritual underground, world, railroad, vibration. Spoken word, dub poetry, hip hop. Spoken word, dub poetry, hip hop. Black voice can't hide. Black voice can't hide. Black voice can't hide. Black voice. So what does a voice becomes when it stands for something? In her award speech for her amazing book of poetry, Head Off and Split, Nikki Finney in the U.S. Recited the 1739 Slave Code of South Carolina, and where a fine of $100 or 6 months of prison for anyone teaching a slave to read and write. So just want that to land, so when people see us getting up and doing our stuff, they know where that is coming from, and that to see that we are forged on the backs of others, mainly through the oral tradition, to be able to create forms and new types of languages is in itself amazing, way beyond any kind of revolution that we can claim. Dub poetry was never intended to compete with traditional European-driven poetry, as reggae music was never intended to compete with classical music. So how people get that conflict, especially academia, is really, I would say a joke, but it's racism. So I would just sort of, leave it at that. Dub crystallized in the early 70s and reached out and reflected its own space and vernacular and the concerns of the personal and the political. The idea of dub as avant-garde goes way back, beyond Walt Whitman. I know a lot of contemporary poets look to the beat, who look to Walt Whitman, and of course to that and other movements in Europe at the time. But I just wanted to bring attention to the fact that Langston Hughes and Walt Whitman had a very fruitful poetic relationship. And this relationship was initiated by Langston Hughes, both men connected by the poetic's marginalization, Langston Hughes by his race and his same love sexuality, and Whitman by his same love sexuality. And who could forget Langston Hughes' memorable poem, I Too Sing America, in its delicious response and conscious entanglement to Walt Whitman's anthem, I Hear America Singing. So that kind of collaboration happens on a human level, a grassroots level, where people come together and connect together around issues that are a concern to them. The African oral tradition, have been one of the oldest and strongest artistic threads in any known human history, and have served to influence many movements outside the African race, and certainly most contemporary Black writers, especially the ones we know, like the poets of the Harlem Renaissance. County Collin, Langston Hughes, Claude McKay, and later we can point to Maya Angelou, Intisa Shange, Nick Giovanni, Jamaican Louis Bennett. But Jamaican Louis Bennett and Bob Marley were more like the people that we wanted to emulate, the dub poets. Kwame Das contend that dub poetry owes much of its spiritual sensuality to reggae music, a stillness, a hint of undulation, a place where the rhythm is in complete control, a sweet place, a spot in the groove that is perfectly comfortable, perfectly right, shaped by this music, this spot, this place. It in itself is a poem. This is a taste of reggae. It emerges in the way the people move to it. Does also contend that dub poetry cannot and should not stand in place of the reggae song, but instead the poem must capture the spirit of reggae in its own terms as poetry, using the resources of poetry. And Maria Casas, who did her PhD thesis, Orality and the Body in the Poetry of LillianAllen and Brand, towards an embodied social semiotics, applied both literary and linguistic theories to the works, and concluded that dub poetry itself was a new modality because it could not be adequately explained by either literary theory or linguistic theory, or even both combined. So sometimes we wonder then where are the academics who are sort of following up on that and looking at that. And I raise that because of the marginalization of such an amazing form that could do so much if people were introduced to it in university and high schools and so forth. So imagine that dub poets broke out of the gates before Public Enemy, and now you hear it spoken or you hear me, oh yeah, rap and so forth. We're the godmothers of that stuff. We influence that. The guys who influenced us and who we worked with, or the people we worked with went to Brooklyn, and that's where rap crystallized. And that's historically noted and captured in many academic papers. There is something about reggae that prepared the way for the kind of poetry we do, dub poetry. And this was taken on the musical and lyrical poet Bob Marley and his worldwide stardom. He created the sensibility for not just the music, but its message. Because there was that deeper aesthetic need that was awakened in the grassroots, and so far mostly served up on radio, commercial music. The poetics of reggae that combine music and message with lines like, "My fear is my undercourage," "Get up, stand up for your rights," "Get up, stand up, don't give up the fight," with its insistence, its repetition, you know, really went below the skin for many people and validated what they had to say. "Cold ground was my bed last night and rock was my pillow. No woman no cry, remember when we used to," everybody could finish that. It was a participatory kind of work. And that was metaphor imitating life. And that speaks to the poet Clyde's notion of the need to reload the cannon with homemade ammunition. So in addition to regular and traditional tributes to of poetry, you know, we know traditional thing of imagery, evocative language, metaphor, simile, etc. Dub brought a whole new addition in terms of that palette, playing with different aspects of sounding for effect, and most importantly, the transmutation of energy that is so essential in creating and awakening something inside of us, that stirring that poets go after. All right, that's part of what happens with the sound. And it's also very necessary in creating community. So it's a very community acknowledging approach, which has expanded and invigorated the idea of poetry, that more people are reading and creating poetry more than any other time in human history. We're also the forebearers of the spoken word. So never before, why aren't people celebrating that? Never before in human history have we seen so many people using language and creating poetry all around the world, urban centers, in rural areas, anywhere. People are now feel like, yeah, I can throw a few words on the page, I can say a few words, I'm ADD, I can't write it, but I can walk around till the, you know, the come out of it, and I can say it. And some statistics shows that I think upwards of 80% of rappers are like ADD. So seriously, why have we not heard from that generation for centuries? So just want to know that the poets share, you know, a common ground with all poetry, and that passion to submit one's life to the apprenticeship of words. A strange and complicated love affair with language, where a line will send the same beautiful shivering feeling as a tender expression of love will, and an irking frustration when you tackle words and phrases that will not do exactly what you have in your imagination or you feel in your body. So, you know, that thing of language, to separate that this is language, the experience of language, it's not life, this is language. In the dub poets, working with language, it becomes life. So dub poets enter the language to explore the complexities of the marginalized, and to free ourselves from dominant culture. We enter it as a place of sheer pleasure and resistance, and a place of insistences. It's poetry as ritual, the way we commune as service to the world of textures, images, sounds, rhythm, and the possibilities we bring to our audience. So the first project of dub is to recreate ourselves in language, to assert our right to exist. For us, dub poetry is the possibility, is a poetry of possibility. Dub also asks, what about the possibility of changing the claustrophobic narrative of being poor, marginalized, and oppressed? Dub concerned that the emerging and individual voice is rooted in the context of collective culture because it calls simultaneously for justice, unity, aesthetic satisfaction, and accountability. The poetry always screams for more voices, more specificity, more individuality, more democracy, not more elitism. And we don't want to make the mistake of being, let me just grab this, of, how are we doing there? Okay, just let me ask you to consider the ideological agenda in claiming poetry for one section of society. And I'll just leave it at that. As Annette Dillard talked about an aesthetic or epistemological probe by means of which artists analyze the world of things and encounters with ideas, Western language from its familiar concerns. Poems are in relation to ideas and things. In new and evocative use of language has the deepest resonance beneath the skin, and conjuring with Jamaican dub poet Luigi Baruka that the poem is to be continued in your mind, 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 your mind. So just want to give you some of the claims that we can make for dub poetry. As the poet has acted in a postmodern decolonizing impulse to create a multimedia, multisensorial, and a bit of a mashup of activist poetry. So here are some of the contributions, some of the claims. Community mobilization, building audience and excitement, disrupting established discourse, and inserts its own agenda. The expansion and democratization of both categories of poet and audience, highlighting the inherent link that was generally diminished between poet and audience because the link was surrendered by giving over the work to elitist arbiters of the culture. And this reflects in one of George Eliot Clarke's famous sayings to me. And you gotta love George Eliot Clarke, who declares, "From the working class I have come, and to the working class I shall return." So it's no question where the solidarity of the poet is, or lies, and where we will take it back to, if we have power or not. Through the feminine voice and concern, dub infused feminist views in what is largely a masculine field of reggae culture, sometimes called a bullpen, and have strengthened feminist voices across cultures. Ideas cannot be ignored once brought forward, especially when backed up by the lived experience of the group, and it speaks across generations and the wider consciousness, opening up space for ideas and discourse that have been one of dub's this has been one of dub's most successful endeavors. Dub can be seen as a remedy for ongoing fragmentation in our daily lives. Dub is an integration of media and senses, music, musicality, sound, voice, words, image, self, ideas, message, audience, poet, community, and responsibility. It actualizes dialogue through artistic practice and using ideas and knowledge in the everyday realm to help school the people, and in does so in such a way that it provides for recognition, participation, and validation. Not the one we get where the books are locked up in the library, or it's too difficult for people to access. Definitely accessibility is one of her things, and connection. Dub has been successful in the stylization of everyday speech and the elevation of vernacular language to art. Dub is a call for action. It's a weapon against being rendered invisible. It asserts and opens up new possibilities for expression. It's a vehicle, a mechanism, and a process for coming to voice. And the question is, where would all those thousands and thousands of spoken word artists be if that space wasn't created? Poetry is a timeless mode of knowing. It's an alternative epistemology. It is knowledge itself. Through poetry, we have come to know so much about the world and to know much about the other. Dub poetry has allowed many to enter and explore their unknowns and have opened up their eyes and hearts to the other. If you agree with Gabriel's Rico view that the essence of intelligence lies in our mind's flexibility, we can judge how intelligent we are of our willingness to exercise that most compassionate and generative aspect of human consciousness, a flexible mind, which is a creative mind. For many, Dub addresses the cellular search for breadth and beauty, that deepest need we have for the rhythmic beauty of ideas, a breath to lift us out of the everyday. This cannot be fulfilled only by one ideal and should not. The enjoyment and engagement of art should never be the sole domain of any one group of people, especially those in control. They'll create nodes of interconnections for the experience of marginalization, create psychic sites of human connectivity. Dawes reminds us that dub poetry is in fact one of the mainstays, dub and spoken words, one of the mainstays of poetic expression in our society today, and has reminded scribal, so-called scribal book poets, of the values of voice and sounding of a poem, introducing to or rekindling to Western society an ancient tradition of oral poetry. Dub and spoken word are integral to connecting to the so-called illiterates and the great masses of the unwashed. And don't we too deserve, I'll put myself there, not because I'm dressed up and have a professor thing, I know where I come from. Don't we too deserve poetry? So Nikki Finney asked in our opening speech, what of the possibility of someday making a poem. And some 30-odd years ago, myself, Clifton, Joseph Devon Houghton did an interview with Fuse magazine titled Robertson. We didn't know what we were doing. It was more an impulse, but there was a rightness about it. And in the magazine, I said, we were never going to stop till this kind of poetry became part of Canadian culture. So we never knew Nikki Finney then, but like her, we knew our history, and we wondered for the generations to come. We too asked, where will they find their possibility of making a poem? And so I'll just end by a few little touches of dub poetry in terms of getting out there. Our poetry is political. We don't care, that land in academia that gets taught or whatever it is. That's bonus. It's like, oh, we'll get away with something. Monday morning broke the news of a robbery. Mom mine went, couldn't hold the load. They took her to the station in a paddy wagon screaming. And Johnny got a gun from an ex-policeman. Oh Lord, oh Lord. Oh, what is your society do to we sons? Rubber dub style in a region park. Man, I dub it in a dance in a region park. Oh Lord, forget your troubles and dance. Limbo dancer, shackles on your feet. Ooh, a Washington, the slave ship resists the lights and feet. So it's both post-language and pre-language. So I'll end by just doing another minute. My latest CD, it's not a sales pitch, but Anxiety, capturing the zeitgeist of the time. Multi-layered, multi-tracked in the thing. There's a piece called Anxiety. The burning of less than 10 o'clock of older kids from many a day. trapped in a web, in the swirling of her body, in the swirling of her body, in the swirling of her body. Thank you.